Welcome to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
All right. Hey, Matthew, how's it going?
Hey, Carl, doing all right.
Oh, man, that is so good. Well, we are just rocking along here. Last episode, we spent time looking at early colonization in the New World. And we looked at the British side because, obviously, in a kind of geopolitical point of view, the British win, and not the French or the Spanish. And those colonies are the ones that eventually become the U.S. And I suggested that in that colonization, you can see core themes and ideas within the founding that are useful for us. And again, we're trying to make sure we can learn from our history and investigate and say, well, what is going on? What was in our past that made it successful? And some from the full colonization, to bring in like all 13 colonies by the early 1700s. I suggest that there are four major themes, kind of like our DNA strands, that create what it means to be the USA. You don't have to like them, by the way. You can say, I'm not one of those. Totally understand. But it's still, in my hypothesis, that it's a kind of the core of who we are as a people. And if you want to understand the United States, knowing these four things, I would suggest they're kind of not secret sauce, but they're the elements of the successful foundation that we have had. And one of those is Christianity. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's kind of where we were last time. Any thoughts or reflections about that? In our conversation?
Yeah, that might have been one of the favorite things that we talked about last episode, is talking about those strands of capitalism, Christianity, rebellion, and there's another R.
Risk.
2
C's, 2 R's.
Yeah.
See how cute I am? I make that for my students. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, and then the more you roll that around, I think you'll go, oh, that holds up. I mean, that really is our DNA.
Yeah, I might want to do like a separate episode. Just we'll see if it needs to be here or not, to go deeper on that. Because there's more things that I think about that are more about the larger understanding of the country, which could be useful for our conversation. But the key is, again, what we're trying to wrestle with is we have a crisis. I think the evidence is clear. In that, then flourishing has vanished. And our unique civic structure, to me, is struggling. And I think it has been struggling for multiple decades. So this is not about anybody current or any situation that's current. And I'm arguing that our history points out that our founders, and it's the men and the women who created the country, roughly 2 million or so by the time you get to the 1776, where we will be today. And they believed that for the unique structure, a unique foundation of their civic government, which would be a government of the people only, without that kind of powerful person or central government on top, that there needed to be a foundation of morality and virtue. And I think today that is where part of the challenge is. For some, we've been saying to our Christian conservative character in the story, they want to take that and kind of ramp it up some. To our progressive character, they're like, I don't really think I want religion at all involved. I don't think we need to have it involved. And of course, what we do from this point forward is a whole different conversation. I'm not yet at this point saying we need to do X, other than saying we need to know our history, and our history that we were successful, and again, with the acknowledgement that we're not perfect. And there certainly were issues, and major issues, ones we should confront and reflect on even today, and how we interface with each other, such as slavery, or how women were not included. And those are flaws. But still, you look at the broad picture and you say, oh, this country was very successful in the story. And so I think history provides a guide for us. It shows us how we did create this. Some would say the most successful nation. I don't think I'd go that far, but it's certainly in that, it's maybe like a top 5. And again, I'm saying to my conservative Christian friends, Christian nationalism is not the correct direction. It is not in historical evidence. And I want to remind everybody what I said back in episode 3. When I say Christian nationalism, I think a lot of people who I know, who I would maybe accuse of this, would back up and go, oh, no, I'm not saying Christian nationalism. But the idea that I think is being presented, what I hear, at least in my ears, is that, well, everybody in the country should be a Christian, or certainly everybody who's elected should be a Christian. Every governing decision should be in alignment with Christian teaching, if not Christian on its face. And while that's laudable, if that's what your aim is, historically, that is not what was done. We're going to prove this out in today's and the next episode after that. But then meanwhile, equally important for my progressive friends, who I would suggest are fighting for a reduction or a limitation of Christianity, or just maybe a reduction of spirituality. It's sort of like, we don't need any of that stuff. We can do it all with our enlightened, rational minds. Well, that's also going in the wrong direction, and it's also not in the historical evidence. So now that fact, and the fact that Christianity was embedded, does that mean that the colonists were intentionally bringing Christianity with them, asserting its independence as a part of the nation? And again, ultimately, they were expecting a Christian nation. Well, we're going to look at the evidence of that. And so what we're going to do today is we need to look decades later, right? So we were in the early 1600s. We skipped the latter Restoration colonies, which, 1660 and beyond. As we get into the moment when leaders from all 13 colonies at that point, they actually invited other people. They invited people from Quebec. They invited people from Florida. Florida was, and Quebec or Canada were both British colonies at this point. The British had taken over Florida as an outcome of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War. But nobody came from those places. And so did those leaders, when they were coming to, we know the short story, the end of the story is they announced themselves as independent. Were they thinking, we are creating a Christian nation, yay? Well, let's kind of dig in to the documents. And what we're going to look at today are two documents that were created in committee by the Second Continental Congress, both starting in 76, one completes in 77. And we want to take a look because I think this helps us. So we were in the 1600s, the kind of early part where you have the colonies, and we noted none of them were thinking that they were even creating a nation. And certainly none of them were creating a quote-unquote Christian nation. The Puritans, we noted, probably coming the close, but we saw how their intention on that ultimately led to division and with argument, which is, again, the point. Maybe you can have a Christian nation. It's probably going to be super small because other people, even people who align with you by title of, I'm that faith also, won't agree with you. Anybody who's ever been involved in churches or organizations know how quickly they split in modern days, is shaking your head going, yep, that is correct. Mm-hmm. All right, so you with me so far?
I am.
I don't just blather on there. All right. So let me give you a kind of a running start for where we are. From 1763 to 1776, events happen that lead ultimately to the moment where these national leaders gather in Philadelphia, right? There's not one thing that kind of tips us over the edge. They're kind of a series of events that move forward. I always call this the road to revolution. But the last big thing is the Boston Tea Party, from which, 1773, from which the government, and remember when we say the government at this point, we're saying the British government, that's ours. The 13 colonies are British. So, and they saw themselves as members of that government. Okay. They respond, and they respond in a way that is actually moderate and narrow, but the colonists saw it as extreme and over the top. And you can see this in the name. The British called this the coercive acts. We want to coerce you back to right behavior. The colonists call it the intolerable acts. These are intolerable. I can't believe you're doing this. And from that, then they decided to have a gathering in Philadelphia that was called the Continental Congress. And this was the first one of these. And they gathered in 74. They meet, they have some conversations. When they come, it's clear that not everybody's in for rebellion. There's a whole bunch of, we're not sure what to do. And there's really kind of three groups. There's the kind of, let's go for it, Sam Adams crowd of revolution now, start a nation, to the, nope, we need to kiss and make up. You guys like Sam Adams are radical crazy people and you're going to ruin everything. Our country is wonderful. And I'll just stop for a second and remind everybody that at the time we are rebelling against the most liberal government in the world. There's nothing about the British government in the 1770s that's extreme or tyrannical or dictatorial, no matter what we wrote and said about it. That's a whole different conversation, but I'd love to have that one if you want to have it sometime. And then there were people in the middle going, I'm not really sure. Well, the moderates and the group that wants to stay loyal, they kind of win the day. They will write a document called the Declaration and Resolves, and they send that off. It's in October of 74. They send that off. And they say, okay, we're going to wait and see what happens from the king. And in the meantime, we will plan to meet again in May of 1775. So October to May comes and goes. They come back, and they haven't really gotten a response. So now it's kind of, well, now what you going to do? We don't know what the king thought. He really didn't think much about the document. The coercive acts had not been rescinded, so they still had there's still British troops in Boston kind of controlling it from the Crown's point of view, from keeping it safe, from the colonists' point of view, from being tyrannical, dictators controlling things. Then in February of 75, the British Parliament declared that Massachusetts was in a state of rebellion. That's followed up a month and a half later in April 19th, a shot heard around the world, Lexington Concord happened. And so now you have these same British troops ending up in a shooting match with their own citizens, and people get killed. It does not go well for the British either. And that really kicks things off. So a month later, the Second Continental Congress starts with this explosion having happened at Lexington and Concord. Once again, the moderates win the day initially. And so they conclude we still need to try to make things calm with our own government. So they send what's called the Olive Branch Petition. This is in July 5th. It's very close to our national holiday. And they write it. And they send it off. It gets taken by hand. So we know kind of the story here. August 21st, they arrive in London. It's given to the king on the 22nd. He refuses to read it. Kind of a refusal. His refusal to read it is kind of like the evidence of the full rejection. Like he's like, no, these guys have all kind of broken the law and been bad boys and bad girls, and I'm not going to hear their petition for peace. August the 23rd, then, the next day, Parliament issues a proclamation that all the colonies were, quote, in open and avowed rebellion. So now Parliament's, in essence, declaring war, and that will come out even more in October of 75, where the king asks Parliament to take direct action. And Parliament does. They pass what's called the Prohibitory Act. It was basically telling the Royal Navy you can capture any American ships. Now, there's no warships. These are all merchant ships. But basically, we're going to stop American trade because we need to reach these people somehow. It's sort of like today when we use financial sanctions on countries we don't like.
Right.
We're like, you've done something bad. And so we're going to stop you. We're going to punish you penalty financially. Same idea comes here. This gets to Philadelphia in February of 76. In January of 76, Thomas Paine has written Common Sense. And so that's kind of changed the equation of percentages. More people now are in support of rebellion. So with these two things, common sense and the fact that the king hasn't, or really Parliament, has in essence declared war, in the spring, there's more movement in what's now the Second Continental Congress to make a statement. So on May the 10th, John Adams puts forward a resolution calling for each of the 13 colonies in their own representative bodies to take a step to declare independence. They do. May 15th, Virginia, which is obviously closest, moves on it. The others will as well. Then in June 7th, Adams was really the leader in the Second Continental Congress, kind of driving for. He now had come from himself being a moderate to being, we got to do this. We need to do this, the right thing to do. So he's determined we're going to push this through. So he's really pushing to make this happen. And so he convinces a Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, to put forward another resolution that would call for these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown and to all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain. So it's like, dun, dun, dun. So in June, the previous one was like each colony do something, and now the guys in Philadelphia are like, we should do something collectively. Right, with me so far?
Yeah.
All right, so the tension is built. This is real. When you dig into the American Revolution, it's a great example of poor communication from all sides. And what happens when you don't listen. So the resolution passes. On June 11th, Congress says, okay, we can't vote on this yet. Some of that's because we just want time to think about it. Some of that's because the moderate and the loyalists are still really nervous. Like, well, you're going to make an actual declaration of independence. This isn't good. So they decide at that point, what we need to do is we need to put forward 3 different committees. And so one committee was going to create a formal declaration. One committee was going to go ahead and write governing documents. And then one committee was going to create what was to be called the model treaty, which was basically a vehicle for us to kind of talk to other nations, mostly France, but other places. And so like, by what rules will we do this? So you can see they're now thinking we need to take these steps as if we were a nation to ourselves. So it's kind of a big deal that they're going to do this. All right. So this kind of gets us to this point that the statement of independence will be called, as you know, the Declaration of Independence, and the governing documents will be called the Articles of Confederation. It's our first government. And then the model treaty. All three will complete their work. All three will be important to these first decade of our existence, kind of a thing. All right, you with me so far?
I am.
It's been a whole bunch of history. Don't want to lose you there. All right. So what we want to see is that the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, written in 76, the AOC, the articles completed, ratified. Well, it's completed in 77. There's a longer story. We'll come back to that in a minute. They give us a reflection of the ideas of the founders and their representation of the people at this starting point of the nation. I mean, obviously, we have to win the war, but if we win the war, they're thinking we will be a nation. So this is a great place for us in our conversation of saying, hey, what was that foundation? What was trying to be done at the time? And how do they set things up? So we want to dig into these. So we're going to start with the Declaration. It's the most famous. Mm-hmm. It's when everybody thinks they know. I'm not so sure they do. And actually, to that point right there, Matthew, another history. I put you on the test last time.
Yeah, you did.
So tell me what you think you know about the Declaration of Independence.
All right. So thinking about the Declaration of Independence, I think of it as, in modern terms, where a couple is breaking up, and on one extreme you have ghosting somebody, and the other, in the middle is breaking up via text, maybe, which is a new, modern phenomenon.
That's terrible.
It's awful. How can we make a terrible situation even worse? Or, eyeball to eyeball. So it feels like this colony was trying to do the honorable thing. I guess they could have traveled over to England to make some kind of presentation, although that feels a little dicey.
Yeah.
And just say, hey, look, this is what we believe. This is the path we're going. The honorable thing is to state what we are going to do and our intentions of what led up to this and what is motivating us to do this. It's them saying, England, it's not us, it's you.
You're exactly that. That is very good. I'm proud of you. Very good.
All right.
What it has become today for many people is not what it is. So what it has become for many people is some sort of like philosophical statement of purpose. It's kind of like the guiding philosophy of the country. And we enshrine it. In fact, for many people, they think of it as a governing document. And unfortunately, this is a flaw or a failure that was started by Jefferson. So don't get me started on how much I dislike Jefferson. My friends who have listened to me in other historical settings, or some of my history friends will know this very well. So I'll just leave that alone. But when he was fighting for his view of the country in, say, 1795 through the early 1800s, he and his friends really began enshrining this idea, like the Declaration was some sort of a lighthouse or a guiding principle, and even kind of a governing document. And then that's a way to understand the tension that happens between the founders. Again, not our purpose today, but was the view of the country represented in the Declaration, or was the view of the country represented in the eventual Constitution, which we'll get to next episode? So in any case, it's not that. It's what you said it is. And that's maybe a good way to say it. It's like a statement written about why we're getting divorced. We're splitting up. This is why we think it's happened. And they kind of walk through a whole bunch of aspects. And we're not going to dig in. I just want to remind everybody, I am very well aware that we could spend a whole hour just on the Declaration and what it means and kind of parse the lines. We're not doing that. We're just looking for our purposes relative to, to it's standing for us in the question we've been dealing with here in Unmoored. But you're very insightful to think of it in a lawyerly way. Because instead of thinking of it as a philosophical statement like written by some Enlightenment leader or philosopher, it's really a legal brief.
They're making the case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, everybody knows, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people, blah, 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 right? And there's that opening, and it is well written, and it does reflect Enlightenment thing, which we're about to talk about. But there's like opening, I want to say maybe 40%, probably a third of the full document, but the rest of it there are 27 statements of a legal nature of saying we have this evidence and this evidence and this evidence and this evidence and this evidence. So that's the whole point. It's like a legal document laying out. Now, what's interesting, not a flaw, but you said we're telling you England. That's not who they sent it to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Enlighten me, man.
Yeah. So they send it to the world.
Okay.
They're writing it to the world.
That's kind of beautiful.
It is kind of beautiful. And they're saying at the end, let these facts be presented to, in essence, the world court of opinion.
Yeah.
So you have to think in terms of they are rebelling. Rebellion is not naturally considered a good thing. It's not a laudable character trait. We would not raise children and say, I hope I teach my child to be rebellious. We kind of know we don't have to teach them. That kind of is already baked in.
Right.
And so you kind of are doing something that's not good. And they know it's not good. When you read the opening sections, you can see that they're aware, hey, we understand this is not what should happen. And they even talk about people who feel oppressed, who are thinking of rebellion, really ought to think about it for a long time. But then, of course, they say that when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce the people, them, under absolute despotism, right? So we need to tell everybody all these things that have happened. And so they're already really setting up an invitation to the world to see it our way, exactly back to divorce. Sadly, this hasn't happened. We know people. It hasn't happened in either of our lives, thankfully. But you can easily imagine that the two partners will, if they're really frustrated, rally the friends to their side versus the other person's side. In some cases, even tragically, trying to poison friends against the other. They might have had mutual friends, and so now they want to capture them. So how do they do that? They start telling their friends all these things. Can you believe she did this and this and this? He was terrible. He did this and this and this. So to use your metaphor, which is a good one, that's kind of what we're walking our way through. So we're kind of trying to make a statement of the declaration that we're going to declare. That's what we're going to do. And then it's this legal brief, let facts be committed to a candid world. They did obviously eventually send it to England, but it in essence was written not to the crown or to England. They're writing it to the world for world opinion. I think to some level you could also say they're writing it to themselves, because you still had a large portion. It's hard to get our head wrapped around or get our hands into how much or how big. But regardless, there was certainly between a third and sometimes maybe 60% of the population who wanted to stay loyal. They're like, I don't know where you guys are going, and I don't think it's gonna be better, so I'm worried. And so they're like, in Philadelphia, you can sort of see them saying, hey, everybody, this is why we've gone down this road. We represent you, but at the same time, we may not represent you. All right. So in Jefferson, he's justifying independence by arguing this concept of the government deriving its power from the extent of the governed. Okay, I just said Jefferson, so let me pause for a second. The first committee, the committee to do this, Thomas Jefferson, is the youngest member. I always tell my students, think of him like the freshman in a class that has all four groups, all four, not grades, but levels of college students. And so he's the freshman. And then Ben Franklin and John Adams are like the seniors. And then there's two other guys nobody knows about. Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston. From all appearance, they didn't really do anything. And they signed off on it, but they didn't do anything. Jefferson, there's a whole conversation, which I won't bore you with, as to why. But Jefferson is assigned the task. Or he's given the task. So again, it's sort of like being in a work group for a college class, and the seniors are like, "Look, freshmen, you go do all the hard stuff.
Yeah.
Get us an edit, and then we'll bring it. We'll get us first effort, and then we'll take it from there." And so he does. And Jefferson is a brilliant, well-written man. And so comes back and presents it to Adams and Franklin. They three of them meet. They both love it. They make a few key edits along the way. They don't edit much, apparently. And so when I say Jefferson justified independence, it's really the committee. But Jefferson's the first writer, and he's leaning on kind of some Enlightenment concepts, and he is taking this idea of the governance, and he's saying, I want to create this unique concept of government, that the governed, the people, so a civic structure of the people. And again, this goes back to something I said in episode 1 and 2, just trying to re-stressing, I guess now, that in 1776, Nobody had this. Remember, I just told you that they were rebelling from England. They were rebelling from the most liberal government in the world. And yet they found it onerous and oppressive. So they're like, it's not right. And ultimately, as we know, we'll see this in the articles in a second, they're going to set up a system that does not have a central figure on top. Remember the power pyramid thing I told you about? The normative state for the humans in history is that there's a power pyramid with a small group on top. And these Americans are going, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to go one step further down the road that's been kind of fleshed out really from the Renaissance. Now, I want to make sure I get this clear. Let me reframe what I'm trying to say here. I'm not saying that the concept was fully unique. It's not like Jefferson and Adams thought of the concept themselves. That make sure everybody understands I'm not saying that. From the time of the Renaissance, there were different thinkers and writers who were kind of proposing this notion, because the Renaissance kind of gives us back in simple terms this idea that the Christians had first presented and had really been lost to the Middle Ages, that the human has value. So now the Renaissance thinkers are saying, right, well, if the human has value, we made this case a couple episodes ago. If the human has value, then the human should be allowed to contribute to the civic structure wherever they live. Like they don't need me to do it for them because they have value, they can learn, they can process. And so they're writing it in the 1600s, so at the time of our early colonization. Most famously, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, they're presenting alternative ways that this could happen. And then in the 1700s, you have some more people from the continent, Montesquieu in the Spirit of the Laws, Rousseau's Social Contract. There's some Scots who are writing about it, who are kind of laying out some possibilities. Hume, Adam Smith, Hutchinson. Hutchinson's earlier than that, but they're thinking, well, how could this look? In fact, there's a lot of Scottish Enlightenment influence that comes in. Many of them have become immigrants over to the New World in the middle 1700s. And for instance, John Witherspoon is the president of Princetown College, so Princeton that we know today. And, and he's got a young James Madison as a student basically right about now. And so, they're teaching these ideas. But again, nowhere on the planet were these concepts being attempted, certainly nowhere at the scale. So you might find some Italian city-states, maybe in the Swiss cantons, maybe it's hard to say exactly what the Netherlands was doing. But so there's some small examples, but again, the Americans are going to say, we're going to wipe the slate clean off the whiteboard. Let's put a new system in place and design from there. All right, so you with me so far? It's too much of me talking.
No, I like it. I think sometimes we assume, everybody had this play in the playbook, and this is the first time to, no, it was kind of an amalgamation of some things that had been discussed but never consolidated and put into action.
Yeah,
I mean, we take it that these ideas have always existed, but these guys brought it together in a unique way.
Yeah. And that's that's just one of the key things. What you just said there, in one sense, if I have goals for my podcast, that's one of them. People realize, oh my gosh, these things that I don't even really know why do we have this thing? That's what people should be asking. Why do we have this thing? Not going on, well, of course we have this thing. Everybody has this thing. Everybody gets to vote. Everybody's got a declaration like this. No. This is so radically new, which is why we should be really concerned about losing it and it going away. And again, we've already just pointed out why. Okay, so for our purposes, let's note two quick things or clear things. First, Jefferson is probably the founder, he and Franklin, but him in particular, who we could say is not a functioning or not a vibrant Christian. Maybe not fair to say non-Christian because that always gets into who is and who isn't, and I'm not going down that road. But he, by his own admission, was like, I don't want to have anything to do with religion. I'm not really interested in Christianity per se, that kind of a thing. And he, in this document, is openly talking about their understanding of the Christian God that was around for this people from their colonization days. And secondly, nowhere in the document do we have a statement of anything about a Christian nation. There's nowhere in there where they're appealing to, we're going to structure this in this way, kind of a thing. Now, it's important to recognize, when I said Jefferson, he's the freshman, he wrote it, he was like one of the youngest people in Philadelphia, but he's eloquent and well-written and very brilliant. He writes it. Adams and Franklin, they're the old guard, particularly Franklin. They clear it out. They add a few things, like they're the ones who added that part we talked about. We remember a couple episodes ago we talked about the question of we hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, Jefferson had written we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, And it was Franklin and Adams who were like, no, that's a little bulky. I'm not sure we want to say they're sacred. So here you have the more Christian John Adams saying, I don't think we want to say sacred, but we hold these truths to be self-evident. But once the document is passed, there's a whole conversation we're not going to go into about its passage, but it's passed. Then the men in the room contributed to editing. So the document you and I read is not Jefferson's document. You can read it, and then you can read the edited document of Adams and Franklin. That's what's ultimately presented. But the document we know is the mind of this group. So now, again, if we had a group that was trying to create a Christian nation, clearly they could make that happen at this moment. And they made several. They made 86 different edits.
It's surprising.
It's huge.
It feels like a high number.
It is a high number.
It makes sense because you want to get it right. But if you were to guess, if you were to tell me how many changes, you're like, no, they probably corrected some spelling and called it a day. Like, oh.
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah, because again, if you say Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson wrote X, wouldn't most of us go, all right, that's good for me?
They're rock stars.
Yeah, I don't need to worry about
these guys
this.
are on money.
Yeah. Which, by the way, that points out something. I've told this to my students when you think, well, why was the United States so successful? And lots of different reasons, but one of them is our bench is so deep. You start looking at people who are at the state level in leadership who never get to Philadelphia. And some of these guys could be like prime ministers or the leading thinker in a nation. And they're not even getting to go to the game.
Yeah, this is 80 Chicago Bulls.
Oh my gosh, these guys are the constellation of leaders that we have. Most revolutions have like one or two great thinkers or thinkers that historians note. The American bench is so freaking deep. So these guys in the room, they're like, okay, got it. We voted on it. Now let's fix it. 86 different edits, right? Now, there's 56 guys who sign it. There are probably only 45 guys in the room. There's a whole other, there's so much I could tell you about the Declaration. About like who signed it, when they signed it, all that kind of stuff. My point is just to make sure we understand it's not just Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, but it's everybody in the room who contribute to what we read. And it's really important to notice then that when you see what is in there, even though there's not these statements, there's a couple of key things, right? So first is the Declaration making this real clear connection, I think it's clear, between the Christian God and the laws of nature when he says early in it, the nature, let me read it. Sorry, I've got it right here. When he says at the beginning, I'm sorry, I'm flipping to the wrong page, that the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Right? So now that's code at the time for Christianity, and it's also a reflection of the Enlightenment thinking of kind of a blendedness between the Christian God, the God that Winthrop had reached out to in his big sermon that we looked at, and what now late 18th century people are thinking about. And there's a whole conversation there. Obviously, the First Great Awakening has just happened about 30 years before, so there's certainly an evangelical or a real passionate movement for the Christian God. But still in thinking, like, how do we reflect this blended nature of who we are kind of here in the colonies? They understood God as active, but with the kind of movement of the scientific revolution and the continued growth coming out of the Renaissance, there's a sense in which, from one point of view, we could say the Christian God as concept had receded back into this idea of kind of the God of nature and him having laws, and that the human could understand God's ideas, by understanding nature. Again, there's a whole other conversation about the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and what that meant. Our point's not to debate that point. Our point's just to note that Jefferson and the founders are being very intentional about this sense of we still are kind of seeing this Christian God as important, and at the same time we are not making it that there's a Christian, nation for them. And the writings of these guys were in, when I say these guys, John Locke, Isaac Newton, they're in the schools that we know of that have started at this point. I think a way to understand this kind of blend that I'm trying to say is that they're intentionally breaking with the norm for a nation in that time in which you always combined the civic entity with a specific religion. Or to say it the other way, our idea of a separation of church and state is unknown in history. When you study history, they're always connected. In fact, what I tell my students is that if you talk to somebody kind of out of the ground in Doc Brown's DeLorean from the 4000 BC, and you told them that we didn't consult with our God or gods, they would say, "Are you crazy? Like, why would you not want your God to be involved in your decision making?" But we would have an answer for that, and part of the answer is this idea of, well, we're kind of not wanting to force anybody in to a system because we're aware of the various ways people can individually reach God or choose not to reach God. These guys could have identified themselves in direct alignment with either a Christian religious group or even just a Christianity in specific, but they don't. But what they do, again, we're trying to add this in the group edit, there are two other clear references that we want to see at the end of the document. These both come at the very kind of tag at the end, and they added things that Jefferson and Franklin and Adams didn't have. So at the end, they write, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled," here's the ad, "appealing to the supreme judge of the world." So they're saying, we want to bring God in. We want to make sure that God, who brought the different colonists here, we think it's important. Then you keep reading through that long, you get to this great there's this final statement that Jefferson had wrote that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Sounds wonderful, right? What the guys in the room said, we know we need to change this. And we say, "And for the support of this declaration," they added, "with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence." So again, it's a code word for them of the Christian God, our God. So we're looking for our God who's protected us. And we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So there's this blended connection that I'm wanting to make sure people kind of get their heads wrapped around. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's not what the two polar extremes either would say. Hey, this is a Christian nation from the get-go, and you're like, well, no, and you're like, no, it's divorced entirely from any sort of religion. It's like, well, it's not really that either.
Exactly.
It's I don't know, but it's kind of liberating to go like get down to the nuts and bolts of like, what does it actually say? That feels like a great starting point or restarting point.
Yeah. And again, you and I think it'd be beneficial to us to kind of be reminded of this history and then go, oh, okay, well, what do I think in the early 21st century? Do I want to do something different? I personally do not. I think these guys were on the money. And so we can go from there. But that's a different conversation. Okay, so the other document, written at the same time, is a governing document. So this is the Statement of Independence. So maybe they don't need to think about it. But in the governing document, certainly they're going to say either no Christianity, that doesn't exist, or they're going to say we're a Christian nation. And I will say, we're going to look at this more next time. By this point, you could look at various colonies, so the pre-state moment, and they did have some governing documents, and they are beginning in 76 to work on them. And in some of those states, they even had a tax that was imposed on everybody to support religion. Same thing we saw Constantine do that you remember I said was a bad idea. Yeah. So you do have some energy in certain states that could be down the road of Christian nationalism. So maybe that'll show up here. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. The writer for this, so there's a representative. So in this group, there's 13 representatives on the committee. But if you've ever been on a committee of more than two people, you know what a disaster that is. So they basically turned to a man from Pennsylvania. He's at Philadelphia. He's actually going to move to Delaware later. John Dickinson, who, by the way, was the principal voice of opposition to the Declaration of Independence. He will not sign the Declaration of Independence, although he will stay a faithful citizen and will participate in the rebellion. He'll fight on our side. But he said, I can't put my name down on this because I do not agree with its principles. But then the group's like, okay, we need to have a rep from every colony, and the Pennsylvanians are like, all right, we pick him. So it just kind of like shows you his stature and his position. And then nobody like John Adams or others said, whoa, not that guy. So they're like, okay, cool. And he ends up being the principal writer of the thing. And so when you read the articles, while it still goes through committee and there's still some editing that takes place, most of it, like with the Declaration, is mostly Jefferson. This is mostly Dickinson. And so Dickinson, he's the first to use the phrase United States of America. Because he's saying the states, remember I told you when we talk about terms, nation is really a synonym to state, which is a synonym to kingdom, a synonym to empire, meaning at a simplistic level. I explained it in an earlier episode, that we see these. So when you see United States, they're not saying united small pieces of a larger whole. They're saying united kind of autonomous large entities into a collective that they considered a confederation called the United States of America.
It's a subtle but very significant difference.
It is very significant, which, again, if we were doing a conversation about some of the later American events or what it meant to have that tension, there's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
We won't have time for that process. He starts writing in 76. They finish it in November of 77. Remind yourself that the war is going on. In fact, in September of 77, the British will capture Philadelphia, and the members of the Congress who were there flee for their lives. So they couldn't just work unhindered. They kind of had to do their thing. They get it finalized in November of 77. Virginia ratifies it quickly, but it takes a while for the others to ratify it. Some of that pressure was because the war just took a while to work these things out. Some of that pressure was because there were fears of the sizes of the states, and the whole conversation of who owned all the rest of the land was a mix. And largely, back to my point about United States, there was still some sense of, yes, let's throw off Great Britain, but when you want me to then subscribe myself to something new, I'm not so sure I want to do that. So right on the beginning, there's a debate about how much power should be in government. So there's some fear of that. But they eventually get it across the line. If you know anything about the U.S. Constitution, and it's ever heard a conversation that involves the Articles, you'll have people talk about the Articles being a weak document. They'll usually even imply it's a bad document. People need to realize that's a feature, not a flaw. That was intentional from the get-go, which again raises a ton of questions about power of government and how government should be structured and what was being thought about at the 76 moment, because it'll be in comparison to the 87 moment, which we'll come back to that in next episode a little bit. Okay, but to our topic, trying to wrap things up here. There is no significant mention of religion or Christianity at all. At the beginning, they make a comment when they're describing it. It's Article 3. They're saying that the states have severally entered into a firm league of friendship, and as a part of that, they will combine themselves for common defense and defend themselves against what? So the very first thing they say, the against what, is against all force offered to on account of religion. So at this point, the idea that they could be attacked by another nation on account of religion, it reflected the world as they understood it. And so they are aware that there is the normative state for all the other nations, and that they were not taking that stance. We're not going to have any single religion. We have lots of different religions. All of them are mostly Christian, though by this point there is a growing but small Jewish population. And so they're like, we just need to realize, if you're a Puritan in New England and the Anglicans or Episcopalians in Virginia get attacked, we expect you to come help. And everybody's like, yeah, we're good with that. The second notion is at the end, where they appeal to the great governor of the world. So again, just like with the Declaration, they don't want to say, or don't say, like we might say, the Christian God, or if you were going to be Jewish, Yahweh, or if you're going to be Jewish, you wouldn't write that at all, of course. But some reflection of that, they're come up with words. Almost always these are capitalized, so it's again a reflection of them and or the printer at the time, noting what you're trying to say. We know what you're trying to say. And all they were saying there is that it pleased the great governor of the world to make us the representatives. That's all they basically say. But they're reflecting themselves as being within a Christian context, and yet at the same time, very clearly, nowhere in the document somehow asserting we're going to have a religion. I mean, again, at this moment, if there was any thought of creating a Christian nation, they clearly could have, but they don't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the mind reels as to what the implications are from that, which is obviously what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Well, and it's that question of how do we organize, and how do we think through this, and how do we blend this? So we do have this long history of Christianity, and yet at the same time, we don't want to force this in, because it's very clear by this point in their minds, if we're going to do this firm league of friendship with 13 colonies that themselves already have significant Christian religious minority groups. So there's different blends of the faith being expressed. And they're working and struggling and dealing with on the state level. They're like at the national level, yeah, we're not touching that. There's no reason for us to touch that. And so I think that's important. Now, it is important to note, though, again, just to make sure everybody's clear, they recognize that Christianity is important for them, which is one of the points we've made for the founders. So, for instance, they quickly, October 1st, 1777, will pass in Congress to have a chaplain. And then after the first chaplain basically steps down, technically he defected to the British, but he leaves, they say, let's do some more. And this time they pick multiple chaplains from different Christian groups. Remember I told you, don't ever say the Americans were trying to create religious liberty, because they weren't. They were trying to create freedom of Christian expression. But that is a liberty within that single denomination or the single world religion of Christianity that's expressed different ways. And instead of, in essence, going to war over it like they'd seen in Europe and other places, we're going to have different guys, and we're just going to say it's going to be great because we think they're basically talking to the same God. And I think that's an important thing to notice. And then later, they will have a chaplain for the armed forces. They will pay for or sponsor at least the publication of a Bible. When they create the Northwest Territory Ordinances, which gives us what we call the Midwest, so Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, all those guys. One of the ordinances will say, or Article 3 of the ordinance will say, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged. So it was their way of saying, hey, we think you new states need to fund education that then teaches about our religious heritage as an aspect of building that moral and virtuous foundation that you have to teach people. That's a huge moment right there. Okay. In closing, right? Does that all make sense? I guess I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I just want to make sure that in both these documents of the Declaration and the Articles, we can see the opportunities there for either side for it to be a complete rejection. You already said it, but just saying it out loud, I guess, again.
Yeah, I mean, even though when the first people came over here from Europe, it came for them to do exercise their religion the way they wanted to, their particular style, and for commerce, but those who came for religious reasons. So even though it was generations hence that all of this happens that we're talking about today, that still has to color everything, right? Yep. So you're like, this is important, yes. But whether we say it or whether it's just understood, we're not going to get prescriptive in the particulars of how it's expressed, because that's why our great everybody's came here. So we're going to create space for everybody, but not get specific about how you got to do it.
Right.
Maybe that's the magic of the whole.
Yeah. They're still wrestling. Like I said, the states, so from 76 on, the states will then begin to write their own constitutions. And we're going to look at those next episode, because this kind of gives us a sense of there is some thought. There are, I don't want to be unfair to my conservative Christian friends. There certainly are some people who would wish in 1776, will wish for it to be a Christian nation. Like, let's say it out loud. Let's put it in the documents. Let's write it right up top. And that those people exist, I'm like, that's fine. But they don't win the day. They are not in the majority, although Christianity is in the majority. So you have a whole group, and I don't mean deists like Jefferson. I mean active, faithful Christians. In fact, if you go back and you look at the revolutionary story, one of the cool things that kind of comes out is one of the leading voices in support of the revolution and in support of the kind of nation they're going to create is coming from pastors. We have several sermons from pastors in all the different states, and they're most of them right out in front saying that this is an okay thing to do, that this marriage between, say, the Christian God and the kind of God of nature, that this is what we think the Bible is teaching. By the way, not everybody has to agree with that, either now or then, but still you have these pastors who are coming out saying that Christianity is very important for us. And we're like, yeah, it is. But at the same time, you don't have the majority of people saying, and it needs to be in our documents in a clear way that certifies us as a nation. just like all the other nations. That's the point. All the other nations have this. And we're going, yeah, we don't want to do this. This is vitally important for our conversation about this tension today. Our solution is not going to be found in enshrining Christianity as a Christian nation, nor will our solution be found in jettisoning Christianity. It's that blendedness, in my opinion, what we're seeing here in the foundation. However, our next episode, we're going to have to confront this challenge of the fact that some of the states are going down that road. And then what does that mean for what will be our next revolution, the creation of a new governing document that we know today as our Constitution? It'll be a stronger government. So they're going to move away from the idea of a weak government that was intentional and seen as positive. They're going to move away from that, create a much stronger government. Well, how does it handle religion? A stronger government obviously could impose religion if it wanted to. And then what do the states do in that regard as they find themselves engaged in this conversation of creating a new nation with a new government in the 1780s, late 1780s. All right?
Looking forward to that.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.